Do you remember Cecil Rhodes, the king of diamonds? The guy that also wanted to discover the Gold of Ophir? Well, eventually, he negotiated an agreement with the Matabele that would allow him to cross their land and go into the Shona land. And in that way, that's where the gold was, and he would establish prospectors there and settlers and so forth. He also planned to bring in a private army.
On your column, forward!
Now you might ask yourself, what did the Matabele get in return? Well, the chief of the Matabele, he got wealth, of course. That's to be expected. But he also got high-quality British rifles, the Martini Henrys, the same issue that the army would use at that time. And he got enough of them to arm 20,000 of his warriors with rifles. And he got tons of ammunition.
Thank you. I have considered the existence of God and decided that there's a 50-50 chance that God exists. Therefore, I propose to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, what would this God want of the world? He would want it well run. I have viewed the peoples of the world and have come to the conclusion that the English-speaking race has the highest ideals of justice, liberty, and peace. Therefore, I shall devote the rest of my life to God's purpose and make the world English. I shall work for the furtherance of the British Empire, the bringing of the whole civilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States of America, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon world into one empire. What a dream. Yet it is possible. It is probable.
Well, that brings us to the Matabele Wars. You did see that coming, didn't you? But let's start with Cecil Rhodes. He was born in England, but he was a sickly child, and his parents decided to send him to South Africa for his health. That was when he was a teenager. He eventually becomes the king of diamonds down there. And as you know, he develops an interest in Ophir. And he sends that pioneering column that we've already discussed into and across the Matabele land into Shona territory. Now, there is the problem. You see, Cecil Rhodes had negotiated agreements with just about everyone who wasn't a European in this area. And one of his agreements with the Shona was a mutual defense pact, so that if the Shona were attacked, Cecil Rhodes' company troops would come to their assistance. Well, the Shona are the traditional prey of the Matabele warriors, and the Matabele sent a raid up after cattle to steal them from the Shona. And the British did come to the Shona's assistance. And that starts off the first Matabele War. Some of the British were looking forward to this possibility. And troops from Fort Salisbury, which is where Harare is today, and Fort Victoria quickly combined and moved toward the Matabele capital at Bulawayo. In the meantime, additional troops were coming up from South Africa. The British column was attacked twice and beat back the Matabele both times because the Matabele, although they had lots of rifles, they were lousy shots. In addition to that, the British had a secret weapon. They had Maxim machine guns. This is the first time that machine gun was ever used by the British on any battlefield anywhere, and it proved to be absolutely devastating to the Matabele, who charged in mass formations, ideal targets for machine guns. As a matter of fact, in one engagement, 50 company soldiers with just 4 Maximum machine guns fought off 5,000 Matabele warriors. This is one of those cases where you can be outnumbered 100 to 1 and win. Lobengula, the king of the Matabele, quickly figured out which way this war was going and decided to immediately evacuate his capital, Bulawayo, which he did, and he took everything that he possibly could, but the ammunition was just too heavy and he couldn't take all of it. So he set fire to the capital so as to leave nothing behind. The fire, of course, caught the ammunition and caused a tremendous explosion. At some point into the retreat into the bush, Lobengula, the king of the Matabele, died. We're not sure just exactly why, but there was a smallpox epidemic going on at that time, and he might have died of smallpox. In pretty quick succession, the Matabele surrendered to the British. This is the point at which this country starts becoming Rhodesia. It was only about a year after the first Matabele War was over that the hostilities broke out again. The king had died. There wasn't any royal power, but there were witch doctors.
Grandpapa, we're ready to eat.
There was one in particular that's referred to as the Imlimo. And he was telling people, he was telling the Matabele, that his magic could turn Western bullets into water and artillery fire into eggshells. Well, that got everybody stirred up, and they began attacking the settlers. Now, of course, the settlers were on farms, they were in isolated positions, they were easily knocked off by the Matabele, and hundreds of people were killed. They weren't just killed, but women and children were killed, and their bodies mutilated, and it was a very bad thing. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that all of the savagery was on the side of the Matabele. I've got a quote from Cecil Rhodes that I'd like to read to you. And it has to do with something that occurred actually after the war was pretty much over, but something that shows that it was the British that were equally savage at this time. Cecil Rhodes once reprimanded a police officer in Matabele land in 1897 for sparing the lives of Matabele rebels who had pleaded for clemency, saying, quote, "You should not spare them. You should kill all you can, as it serves a lesson to them." They count up the killed, and they say so-and-so is dead, and so-and-so is no longer here, and they begin to fear you. We're going to be turning now to a very interesting American that was in southern Africa. I've been reading this book, Scouting on Two Continents, by Major Frederick Burnham. Now, Major Frederick Burnham was an American, but that major, that's a major in the British Army, not the American Army. Scouting on two continents, he started out life scouting against Indians, mostly Apaches. Of course, that was in the United States, and then he went to Southern Africa. And in Southern Africa, he worked with the British Army, scouting against Matabele, and also later on against the Boers. He met lots of interesting people, Queen Victoria for one, Teddy Roosevelt for another, was a friend of his. He did all kinds of things. In addition to scouting, he also did gold prospecting in Africa and in the United States, in California. As a matter of fact, when he came back to California after scouting in Southern Africa, he struck oil and he ended life rich. But my favorite story about Frederick Burnham has to do with when he was an infant. You see, he was born on an Indian reservation, although neither he nor his parents were American Indians, a Sioux reservation as a matter of fact. And in this particular case, he was born near the Civil War. The Civil War was on at the time of this story, and that means that there were very few Union troops in the area. And the Sioux decided that this was an excellent time to go on the warpath. And the word spread amongst the European population of that area. And Fred's father went into town to buy extra ammunition because he knew he was vulnerable. While he was in town buying that extra ammunition, though, his wife saw some Sioux approaching their cabin, and they had war paint on. So she grabbed little Fred and she took off. Now, she knew she couldn't outrun the Indians with Fred, so she ditched Fred in a cornfield. The corn was green at the time. And she took off. And the Indians did come, and they burned their cabin down, but they couldn't burn the cornfield down because it was green. So when Fred's mother came back, she found Fred happy as a clam just where she left him. Fred grew up with Indians, probably some of the same children whose father had burned down their cabin years ago. And he learned a great deal about scouting from them and from the other scouts that were being used by the Army at that time. One of the advantages that Fred has in talking about the Matabele is that he can compare the Matabele with the Apaches. And he says that the Apaches were much better trackers than the Matabele. And this makes a certain amount of sense because, after all, the Apaches made their living hunting. The Matabele did not. They were basically cattle raisers, ranchers. But that's not why I started reading about Major Burnham. Instead, it's his exploits in the Second Matabele War. In the Second War, you'll recall, the country of the Matabele was not ruled by a king anymore. There was a sort of interregnum. And in that power vacuum, what happened was the witch doctors basically took control. And they stirred the people up against the British. The Matabele began attacking the British because they thought that the witch doctors could make the British bullets turn into water and their artillery shells into eggshells. Well, of course that didn't happen, but the war was still going on. And Major Burnham and another person that's mentioned in this book were authorized to go out on an expedition to find the major witch doctor, the guy that was stirring up all the trouble. And they reported back that they located him, they found him in a cave, and they killed him. Now that wasn't too far away from a Matabele village, so they had to run like Dickens in order to get out of the Matabele territory. But nevertheless, Major Burnham says that killing that witch doctor basically ended the Second Matabele War. If Major Burnham's account of all of his exploits in his book are correct, he's the world's greatest scout. In the alternative, he's the world's greatest liar. I told you earlier a little bit about Frederick Burnham and his exploits here in Zimbabwe, or what is now Zimbabwe, at that time Rhodesia. And I have with me my guide, Paul, who's an expert on the Matabele Wars. Have I got that right, Paul?
Yes, you do. Thank you.
Okay, good. Now, as I understand it, Major Burnham and a friend of his, Armstrong, came out into this general area during the Second Matabele War, and they found the Inlimo, who was causing all the trouble for the settlers in the area, and that was generating the rebellion. They killed him in a cave nearby here someplace, and then they galloped away in order to escape from the Matabele. Have I got that right?
Well, as historians, we probably argue with some of the content of that. The idea that the Mlimo was the instigator of much of the unrest in this area was a contested one even in Burnham's time, and his exact identity was never accurately ascertained. Burnham and Armstrong certainly came out into this area and did kill someone that they thought was the Mlimo, but how they identified him so confidently is a bit of a mystery, because all we have to go on mainly is Burnham's own published account.
Oh, but with Burnham's account, it's obvious that the person was the Inlimo because he was in that sacred cave when they killed him. He was giving incantations. Isn't that proof, or some proof?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that very simple sentence, but to keep it very short, today we don't think that the priests of the Mwali religion, which is spread out throughout the Matabele Hills, were the full leaders of the uprising against the whites and their rule at that time. So Burnham's story about leaping up into a cave and shooting someone in the midst of some arcane ritual is a very, very romantic account. And indeed, it was not corroborated by his partner Armstrong at the time in any form of writing. Burnham just would say, Armstrong agrees that this is what we did, and then moved on from it. What several later historians have actually managed to reveal is that it's unlikely Burnham ever went up even into a cave and possibly shot a man in a field who was working in his fields at the time like that, because several other accounts of interviews of people done here in the 1920s, 1930s by early historians trying to follow in the footsteps here did not corroborate Burnham's story in the slightest.
Oh, but Burnham's story must be true, because the fact is that the war ended almost immediately after he killed the Inlimo.
Well, that was a neat editorial trick in Burnham's book, Scouting on Two Continents, because he makes it seem like, he kills the Mlimo, as he likes to put it, and then the war ended shortly after. And what he skips out on is the fact that he leaves Matabele land sometime in early July, and the war continued for another 2 months with intense fighting. And then towards late August of that year is when Cecil Rhodes takes a gamble and manages to make contact with the Ndebele leadership and begin to negotiate a peace, which takes another 2 months, September into October, before the war, at least in Matabele land, is over. And the war, as it continued much longer in Mashonaland, for over another year before that war was ended as well. So a little bit of creative editing there of the story, I would say.
Well, he killed someone. Is that correct?
I would believe so, yes. Because how we know that he came in here and killed someone is because there were actually protests from some of the Ndebele leadership who were neutrals in the war in this area at that point. You had incursions from other military groups at the time coming in here. But the main Induna or leader of the Ndebele in this area actually chose to be neutral for much of the war, eventually allying himself with the whites later on. And he actually makes a formal complaint to the administrator, who's the equivalent of the governor at that time, and says, we've just had someone just shot in our area. What's going on? Why are you attacking us? And there's several, days of worry, because they thought that might have pushed him over to joining with the rest of the Ndebele, but events swung the other way.
So Burnham's action didn't end the war, is that right?
I would absolutely, he did not. He had a significant role as a scout and as a soldier throughout the early parts of the campaign, but that one action did nothing to actually bring the war to a quicker close.
That's all very, very interesting. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, if Frederick Burnham's actions didn't end the war, then Cecil Rhodes' actions almost certainly did. The war went on. It looked like it was going to be interminable, and it was costing a great deal of money, and I think that's one of the driving factors for Cecil Rhodes. It's basically encouraged him to bravely go into the Matabele territory, into their heartland, and negotiate with their leaders on a very personal basis.
Amehlo amhlophe.
Yebo, amehlo amhlophe. Khosi wena umzingelo omkhulu.
Good. Shall we...
Is it peace?
Sihlangene ngokuthula na.
Yebo. Thina siza ngokuthula.
It is peace.
Now, after all that had happened, you might think that the Matabele held a grudge against Cecil Rhodes. But in fact, they held him in fairly high esteem. I'm going to be coming back to that later. But keep in mind, the Matabele did not dislike Cecil Rhodes. They trusted him. We're going to change our focus now to railroads. One of the first things that Cecil Rhodes wanted to do was to get a railroad up to Victoria Falls. The reason for that is obvious. Today, it's a huge tourist attraction, and it was even in his day.
It was Cecil Rhodes who dreamt of a bridge across the Zambezi where the trains as they pass will catch the spray of the falls. Opened in 1905, the bridge was hailed as a man-made engineering wonder to rival the natural beauty of the falls themselves. Today, the bridge is...
But of course, I'm not visiting the falls by rail. I'm using a helicopter. Right now, the Zambezi River is kind of at a low water level. That actually helps you to see the falls. because when the falls are at full water level and huge amounts are coming down, usually in March or so, what you see is very little because there's so much spray coming up from all the water dropping down into that crack in the ground that you really can't see the falls at all. So this is, in many ways, the best view at the best time of year for Victoria Falls. Here we spy some local residents headed for the river. He's also the person that came up with the idea of a Cape Town to Cairo railway. That is a railway that went all the way across Africa from north to south. And the British came very close to achieving that objective. The British occupied territory virtually all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. The big exception was German East Africa, but Cecil Rhodes was able to negotiate with the Germans and get a right-of-way for the railroad. And, of course, after World War I, the Brits also occupied what was German East Africa. We're moving on now to visit the railway car that was Cecil Rhodes' personal railway car. Yes, he had his own, and used it quite extensively for travel. The railway carriage that I'm in right now used to belong to Cecil Rhodes. I've talked about him already, so you know about Cecil Rhodes. And what I'm going to do is I want to take you through his carriage and show you some of the rooms that are in here. I think it's very interesting. So will you follow me in and we'll take a look. It's a little bit tight in here, but there's an awful lot that Cecil packed into this carriage. This carriage was actually constructed in a sense, that is, the materials were assembled in the United States and then broken down and brought by ship to South Africa and reassembled. The wood that's in here, I've been told, is a Burmese teak. And this spot right here has actually been changed since Cecil Rhodes was here. I want you to look down, if you can, with me, and you'll see a metal plate here with a hole in it. Do you see the metal plate with the hole? There used to be a bed here, and the bed just kind of stood up, and that was the hinge that allowed the bed to come down and for Cecil Rhodes to sleep in the bed. I'm going to move over to the bathroom now. This is the sink that he would have used, and as we go through, I want you to take a look at the bathtub, and then we'll move on further back. Okay, now this part of the carriage is actually for any guests that Cecil Rhodes might happen to have. Now if you look down here, you can see that the seats have been rearranged so that there could be a bed here. And over here, the seats are arranged as seats, but of course they could also be turned into a bed. In addition, on both sides, you've got beds that could come down off of the wall. And so the result is he could have 4 guests in here at a time. I'm going to move further on back. This room in here is where the cook would have lived. He's the most important person in the carriage. And now we've gotten all the way to the end of the carriage. And this is where the kitchen is. The oven is here. There are warming boxes up here. And over on the other side, this is the sink where the cook would clean things up. Okay. After the wars were over, Cecil Rhodes was also responsible for setting up the Rhodes Scholarship. This is the one where people that eventually became prime ministers of Canada, Australia, Malta, and even Bill Clinton picked up Rhodes Scholarships. That's where that comes from. We're back up in the Matopos area, the area that was the heartland, or the spiritual land, if you will, of the Matabele. And you can tell it's a Matopo because of all those hills with rocks on the top of it. That's characteristic of this particular area. It happens that this is my lodge, in fact, my specific room in the Matopos. You can tell that it is different from the rocks around it because there is a thatched roof there that you can make out. But it's amongst those rocks so that it blends in perfectly with the rest of the scenery. There's one particular hill called the Hill of Benevolent Spirits. Well, at least in English it is. And that's where Cecil Rhodes wanted to be buried. He said in his last will and testament, "I admire the grandeur and loneliness of the Matopos in Rhodesia, and therefore I desired to be buried in the Matopos on the hill which I used to visit and which I called a view of the world." In a square to be cut in the rock on the top of the hill, covered with a plain brass plaque with the words thereon, "Here lie the remains of Cecil John Rhodes." Well, on the 10th of April, 1902, Rhodes' coffin was embedded in this particular place. And it's generally referred to as a haunt of the ancestral spirits by the local people. The Ndebele chiefs were at the ceremony, and they requested that guns not be fired at the funeral, as tradition dictates, because it would disturb the spirits of this vicinity. They sent him on his way with the Ndebele royal salute, Bayete. Later residents of Zimbabwe have often been considerably less kind. It has been popular for some time for people to criticize Cecil Rhodes for things that he said that were, well, frankly, not politically correct. Usually when someone does or says things like that today, we go back and we say, well, that person was a man of his times. That is, everybody believed essentially what he did, and he was no better and no worse. But in Cecil Rhodes' case, you can't really say that, because he was widely criticized for his opinions in his day.